Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. It's very nice that you could all join us tonight. I appreciate everybody taking the time. Thanks for zooming in. I'm Aaron Johnson. I'm the Associate Dean of Distributed Learning and Rural Initiatives at the University of Calgary, and I'm Chair-elect of the Section of Teachers of the College of Family Physicians of Canada. As we begin our webinar this evening, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are speaking to you from. Many of you may be in different regions across the country, and as I acknowledge the land that I am on tonight, I would invite each of you to think about the particular land that you are on tonight and what that means to you. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and also that the city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Tonight's webinar was developed over the last week due to preceptor requests for information about this topic. The webinar is a team effort. It involves people from my office, Distributed Learning and Rural Initiatives, people from this Continuing Medical Education and Professional Development Office, the Office of Faculty Development, and the Department of Family Medicine. Tonight, we will focus mainly on the teaching aspects of virtual care, but we recognize that other issues are also important. We respect the fact that fee-for-service and virtual care are not currently well aligned in Alberta. That is not the focus tonight, but we recognize that this is part of the reality. We'll put some links in the chat and the question and answer notes to webinars that the Alberta Medical Association has put on, as well as resources produced by the College of Family Physicians of Canada about virtual care. I'd invite you to open the question and answer, the Q&A feature that you'll see at the bottom taskbar in Zoom, and type any questions that you have into there as the evening goes along. If you see questions that you like, please upvote them. We'll do our best to answer the most popular questions, either in the inline chat or at the Q&A session at the end of tonight's webinar. A reminder that we are recording tonight's event, and we will be posting the video online and creating a question and answer document based on the questions that you type in tonight. We have a great team tonight, and I'm proud to introduce them to you. We have Dr. Ima Ghee and Dr. Sanjeev Batla, both family physicians who have extensive history and experience using virtual care. We have Dr. Andrea Moore, who is an R2 family medicine resident, currently working with Dr. Batla, and has been training and doing virtual care for the last weeks and months. We also have on the line Dr. Lindsay Jancy, the current family medicine program director at the University of Calgary, and Dr. Steve Mintsulis, the past program director in family medicine at the University of Calgary, who will help us during the question and answer session at the end of tonight's event. We have no specific financial disclosures to make. Both Dr. Kelly Burak and I receive salary support from the University of Alberta, and Dr. Ima Ghee has a business background in virtual care, but does not have any current financial conflicts of interest. The final person I'd like to introduce tonight is Dr. Kelly Burak. Kelly is the Associate Dean of Continuing Medical Education and Professional Development at the University of Calgary. I'm happy to welcome him here tonight. He's going to continue on and ask the panel a number of questions that were submitted to us by preceptors to guide the opening of our conversation. As we come to the end, Kelly will help us to field the questions that you place in the question and answer box, and all the panel will come together and answer all of your questions as best as we can. So Kelly, welcome, and I'll turn the event over to you.
Great, thanks, Aaron. Hope everybody can hear me okay. So let's kick it off, and I'm going to throw out a few questions to our panelists, and maybe we'll start with Sanjeev. Can you tell us about your experience with virtual medicine? Sanjeev, are you there? Sanjeev? All right. You guys can't hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. So maybe I'll jump in and then Sanjeev could
Hema,
join
go
in.
ahead.
Yeah, when he's back on stream. So I've been using virtual care in one form or the other, typically telephone for pretty much since I was training. I did work in the UK for a while, and it's commonplace to pick up the phone
Hey
and call
guys,
patients.
should we be able to hear each other?
Yeah, Sanjeev, you should be able to hear us.
Yep. Sorry, we had
Yeah,
we had
maybe.
rehearsed this and we could hear
Can't
everybody
hear
just
anyone.
fine before. So
Okay, so so I was making reference to about 20 years ago using the phone, and then moving forward to recently with the introduction of the video chats, Zoom for instance, and I've used the entire gamut of it. I've been doing video consults for the past 4 years or so with my panel of patients. I've had a small core of patients who know about it and they're keen, so they use that often. But the telephone is always there. Also, we've used a bit of text and a bit of secure mail, not very effectively, the secure mail, probably sending results that patients want copies of. But with the advent of my Health Alberta platform, that has taken care of that. So I simply point patients to that. That's been sort of a summary of my experience. Sanjeev?
I've been doing virtual care for 1.5 weeks, and my big plug here would be let's not get in our own way. Let's focus on what's most important, which is doing the best care we can for our patients right now, and um, and yeah, not making something that's relatively not that complicated, making it too complicated. It has worked amazingly well, and I look forward to sharing more of my experiences as we carry on here.
can you guys answer a question as to the specific platforms that you use? And we've had some advice, I believe, from our regulator from the CPSA about what's acceptable. Hema, did you want to take that, please?
Sure. Prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, there were a few platforms that will meet the regulations that CPSA stipulated. So I was previously using Medio. There are other platforms that mainly came out of the US, but I think in recent times, some other platforms in Canada have come on stream. Since the advent of the COVID-19, of course, CPSC has really said the main thrust is look after our patients however we could. So Zoom has come on stream. People have been using FaceTime. People have been using everything. But again, the phone has always been and always remained a secure, well, I won't say secure, but fairly reliable means of doing virtual care. Those have been the main platforms I've tended to use. But right now, I've been using Zoom a lot more, and I'm using the AHS Zoom.
Sanjeev, anything to add?
I'm finding that the telephone is very, very valuable, especially as when it comes to teaching with residents and using conference calling. You can get patients in the room, so to speak, as well. And then the Zoom, I've used the Zoom a few times, mostly with patients with counseling, where I really do find it helpful to see their reactions and their body language is more critical then. But yes, right now for me, it's been the phone, mostly my iPhone, and Zoom.
Okay, the next question I have, is about patients' perceptions of virtual care. So maybe, Andrea, let's get a resident's perspective on this. Would you like to take that question?
Regardless, so I'm kind of in the position with Dr. Batler where things have been evolving kind of over the last week and a half. And so for starters, we don't really have any formal evaluation of how things are going from the patients. So we just kind of get an idea in a sense from talking to them through interactions without kind of any formal assessment of how they feel about things. So first of all, when I'm asking them over the phone, I'm getting a lot of positive feedback in terms of how they feel the visits are going, but that's obviously a little bit biased, as it's kind of all part of that interaction. It'd be nice going forward to get more of their opinion. But so far, a lot of the patients have commented on how convenient it's been for them, especially in the context of what's going on right now. Patients that have to stay home from self-isolation, patients who have kiddos and other things that are, and other people that are in their care. And I get a lot of patients saying how surprised they are in terms of how well everything has worked out and how kind of seamless the care was, and that they felt comfortable and not concerned about the fact that we weren't able to see them in the office. So it's been largely positive feedback that we've had so far.
Kelly, I would say the same, because I'm often coming onto the phone with Andrea, and I can tell that the patients are really comfortable with the conversation, and I can tell that they've been comfortable sometimes talking with mostly Andrea. So I would concur that patients so far seem to find it very comfortable.
Yeah. Again, I'll add to the same. And prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, there was a small core group of patients that knew about it and they were keen users. My complication was they had to download an app. So not everybody wants to download an app, but that group that downloaded the app were happy and they kept using it. Now with the outbreak of COVID and we're doing a lot of virtual visits, I've been finding that people don't seem to mind using Zoom. And I believe the aspect of Zoom makes it more amenable to usage that way.
So can I ask a question about just starting a virtual visit? This isn't something that I've done yet, other than the low-tech phone version. But how do you normally start off a virtual visit with a patient, and are there any issues around consent that are important to consider?
Basically, I treat a virtual visit as though I'm doing a face-to-face visit. The patient booked the appointment, so I typically believe they've already consented. So I more or less walk into the virtual room and do the pleasantries, and then we start. Now, with the recent outbreak of COVID again, things have changed a bit, because initially I used an ordinary Skype account that I had. So I informed the patients that this is not secure, and people could intercept their information. I still say the same thing. And then what I initially did again is I sent a blast, bulk email to all my patients with the statement from the CPSA, essentially saying, because of the unprecedented situation, we are using platforms that normally we would not use, and there is a risk of interception. And again, once patients book, my assumption is they've read that, they've consented to it. But that tends to be the way I approach it. It's kind of normal day-to-day type practice for me, I would say.
Okay. Let's shift our focus now a little bit to talk about, learners and teaching in the virtual care setting. So I know, learners in general tend to be quite comfortable with technology, but Andrea, would you want to comment about comfort with virtual care and what you think of it?
Sure. So initially, first few days to hours, I was feeling very uncomfortable and very uneasy, to be perfectly honest. But within a few days, I felt a big increase in my confidence. And I think it's important to remember that as residents, this is something we go through on a really regular basis. Every month we're kind of thrust into a new rotation and having to work with different people and kind of change our approach. That part was a little bit intimidating initially, but I think I kind of got over that hump quickly. I think initially I had a lot of fears surrounding how we'd adapt to effectively and safely care for patients and how that would work with my confidence, and also kind of thinking about especially as an R2 getting towards the end of residency, I really feel that at this time every learning opportunity is really important and we don't want to have any wasted time. So initially there was kind of some discomfort surrounding how this might work, and we were thrust into the situation kind of out of necessity. But very quickly I found that as we started to iron out the kinks and deliver some good patient care, that I became comfortable quite quickly. And I'm not somebody who's very tech savvy. I'll throw that out there as well. So I was able to adapt, and I think that any resident would probably be able to do the same thing.
Okay, so next week I'm going to go back to work for, you know, the first time in 2 weeks and after self-isolation, and you know, I'm going to be learning myself just how to do virtual care. How can I possibly teach it? Maybe Sanjeev, can I throw that question to you?
Absolutely, and just to comment on something Andrea said also is, I'm not a tech savvy person, and we've been ironing out kinks for the last week and a half, and I've been really surprised with how quick the learning curve is, and teaching has actually been very fun because when we're doing it on the telephone, we can teleconference between each other, and the opportunity to talk to Andrea at the same time as the patient is just the same as it is in the office, which is really fun. And then all the skills that we talk about are the same. You know, how to take a history. You know, history gives us the vast majority of what we're looking for. How we choose our words to convey empathy and compassion. All that stuff we all know how to do that. So we're not learning any new skills there. In fact, I think we have some examples where I'd say we get to hone in on certain skills. For instance, we had a patient with a fever, a baby with a fever, and it really got Andrea and I with the patient really honing in on how do you use your history-taking skills to assess how sick is this baby. So it's really been very good. And then there's also the opportunity to do shared counseling through Zoom or any other video. And the exciting thing with that is that it actually, in my mind, might make things even easier to do more direct observation where I'm there, but I'm not in the room. So I can kind of observe, but not quite as present. And so the resident can take a history a little more naturally. We're going to be doing that next week.
Ima, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. Both of them have spoken very well to the topic. I would say it's something that once you need to just start and then gradually build on it. We're very comfortable with the telephone. I'll argue that we've pretty much all used some sort of video chat, FaceTime, Skype, and so on. This is not really dissimilar. The main thing is it's the interaction we have daily with our patients that is being enhanced with technology.
So I'll ask another question to you then, like about the actual observation of the learner. I think Sanjeev talked to it a little bit already, but what does a system of supervision look like, and how do you actually make that work in the virtual setting compared to like my clinic where I may be seeing my own patient, and then while the resident is seeing another patient in another room? How can you make that work in the virtual setting?
I think it's very similar to in the clinic. Obviously not exactly the same, but it involves the same kinds of things we need to assess in the clinic. What do I know of this patient, and how well do I know the learner I'm working with? How well does the learner know me? And so I need to develop a sense of what that learner feels comfortable with, what kind of history taking they can do on their own. And so I can choose, again, just like in the clinic, I can choose as much time as I want to be part of that conversation or part of that video interaction. So it's amazing. It's not that different.
Okay. Ima, anything to add to that, or Andrea?
No, it's good.
Go ahead.
No, for me, it's really pretty much the same. I think the added bonus might possibly be where you can record and then both review it together. If you're using a video platform like Zoom that has recording functionalities, of course, you have to get the patient's consent to agree for you to record it. But other than that, Sanjeev has really hit it on the head.
Andrea, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. How does it feel different in the virtual setting compared to in person?
I think there's a lot more similarities than differences, to be perfectly honest. I think we're challenged on a lot of levels that have already been mentioned to really hone into our history taking skills and not really cut any corners, and pay attention to the things that we can observe from the patient just by listening to them or just by seeing them in their environment. And it actually sometimes, I think, takes away some of the distractions that we have in the day in clinic when we're just paying attention to our listening and the messages that we're getting from patients. So those, I think, are the most important things of our interactions anyhow. So it allows us to focus in on that. So I think there's more similarities than differences. And we'll talk, I think, a little bit later about how clinical reasoning looks different and how we're challenged to think differently, not only in virtual care, but with the limitations we have right now in the pandemic. And I think that's kind of more where I've seen more major changes in terms of how I'm going to care for patients, and as a resident, how I'm going to be effective in my clinical reasoning. And I think that's actually been one of the greatest benefits, but I think we'll chat about that in a bit as well.
So one technical question, I guess, as a follow-up, does the learner and the preceptor need to be in the same physical space, or with people self-isolating and things, can you be working completely in different areas? Sanjeev, do you want to take that?
Oh, I was gonna get Andrew to answer that, but that's okay. I think it works really well. I think it's not that different once again. So I guess I also didn't want to speak for Andrea in the sense that I feel like we have once you've developed a process with your resident about when do we call in, how do we connect, and you have a good understanding of how to use shared technology, whether it be video or whether it be telephone, it feels like she's right next to me in terms of being able to reach out to her right away, being able to, if it's a more complicated history, I'm going to be there for the whole conversation, and I'll feel comfortable interrupting. And so I haven't felt that it's a hindrance. Maybe you should comment to that as well, Andrea.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's about setting up a system that's effective for communication. We need to do that in the clinic, just like we'd have to do that in virtual care. And it looks definitely a little bit different here. And it took us, I think, a few days to figure out a system that would work best. And when I say for us, I'm talking about between myself and Dr. Batla for his patients in clinic that we're working with right now. And I think depending on the patients that you're working with, the types of issues that you're addressing, and the relationship between the preceptor and the learner, that might look slightly different for everyone. But so long as you have a system set in place where you have a really nice open communication where concerns can be brought up, then I haven't found it to be a hindrance at all either. I would agree.
Okay. So we talked about observing a history and being there in the background to observe that. But what skills can you observe in the trainee? Maybe I'll throw that to you, Ima.
Again, I keep harping on this. It's not too dissimilar from when you are in the same space you're observing trainee on a day-to-day basis. You're seeing how do they assess patients, what skills are they exhibiting, are they acting professionally, are there any selectivity concerns with regards to the choices they make with procedures, investigations, and so on. So that pretty much is the way I'll say it. I'll add a little bit to the previous comments also, that with a platform like Zoom that allows attendance into a waiting room and multiple people to be involved in a consult, I as a preceptor can be in the background. The patient knows I'm there and I'm sitting down watching and listening. The great thing is, unlike a face-to-face, you don't change the dynamic of the consultation as much, because very quickly the patient will forget because you're not physically in that space. But then it allows you the opportunity to observe things that are happening, and be able to then, after you finish the consult, again, take the patient out of the virtual room, and then you and the resident are able to have a debrief and discuss what happened. Again, I think it's less stressful for the resident also because you're not right there in the room physically. So it does actually give it has its own benefits.
Andrea, anything to add?
No, I think I would agree with that. I guess the only thing to add there is in terms of something that you can observe, not just specific to virtual medicine, but I think also in kind of this pandemic context that's been new for me in terms of pushing my clinical reasoning, is that, and I think Dr. Guy already mentioned, the kind of selectivity piece has been a big part of what we've been talking about and evaluating here, and that's you have to make a kind of a different decision-making tree when you're talking about the safety and further investigations and assessment of a patient. Like I have to make a decision, is it necessary? What are the pros and cons about getting this individual in for a physical exam? And we find ourselves having conversations about and thinking about maybe for more simple problems that we kind of autopilot on, like swabs for strep throat, et cetera. Like in this context, what makes sense in terms of next steps when there's a risk for people to potentially be leaving their homes. We have to think about resource allocation kind of in the pandemic. So it kind of makes me think on a deeper level about all the day-to-day decisions I'm making, which I think is in a way strengthened my clinical reasoning even in this short time. And that's, I think, a great thing that I've been able to gain some feedback on that I wouldn't have in another setting.
Okay, we're going to get to the questions from the audience very quickly here, but maybe I can ask a question about what kind of things you can actually. You raised a point about having to bring a patient in for a face-to-face examination. What kind of things can you actually observe in a virtual setting, and what kind of technologies can help with that?
For sure. So I guess first just starting with a phone visit, which is truly how we're conducting the majority of our visits. From a respiratory distress perspective, for example, you can hear a lot in terms of the patient's work of breathing. You can hear and notice something about their emotional comfort or emotional level of distress just by listening to their voice, like we do in a psych mental status exam. And so I think just by really focusing on listening, and like I had said before, without the distractions of other things that come along with our interactions in clinic, you can learn a lot there. I've even, just by listening to patients, been able to mention, hey, you sound a little bit congested, or does your voice usually sound like this if they're sounding a little bit hoarse to me? So that's even what we can observe just by being on the phone. And then I think video, if and when used, and in some contexts it's great, you have the opportunity to observe the patient's surroundings, their home, which can be pretty relevant. If they're moving around and having to adjust technology and whatnot, how they're able to do that. Again, just kind of like that sick versus well, even through a video chat, I feel like we've been pretty well able to establish that. And we've gotten pretty creative in terms of physical exam maneuvers that I've felt to be necessary, like talking with the patient about how they could take their pulse, or the sorts of things I'm looking at when I'm evaluating how they're breathing, which has been great for me in terms of being creative and adaptable, but I think also educates the patient a little bit as well and kind of gets them more involved in their care and understanding the sorts of things we do in physical exam. So yeah, I think there's a lot more to observe than I think I would have initially imagined or appreciated, as long as you have the ability to be open-minded, creative, and kind of bring your patients on your side. And every patient that I've had an interaction with has been happy to do that. We've been like blanching rashes together and, palpating for tenderness. And I think that's been a really cool experience, actually.
Interesting.
Sorry, Kelly, I was just going to add, if it's okay, that really has been an aspect of this that's been very exciting. It's very fun to talk to the resident also about, when they describe the rash and stuff, and then we can talk about, and was it tender, and that requires, of course, that we ask, right, as opposed to being present to actually press on the lesion. So it really gets you thinking about things in a way that's, I agree with Andrea, very deeper, and you need to get creative. We've also been very careful with things like rashes, and we've had a couple of cases where we've had them where when something didn't fit right, we've had them send in a picture of the rash through their cell phone, and the picture comes out quite nice, and we've altered a diagnosis based on a picture. I'm thinking of that periorbital dermatitis, right? So the periorificial dermatitis. So you can use that as well.
Okay. So let's get to a very important part of medical education, and that, I guess that's the teaching and feedback that goes on when we have a learner with us. Can you talk about how that's handled in the virtual space, especially when you're not physically in the same place? Can you pause the call when you want to speak to your preceptor, or how does that actually happen? Sanjeev, maybe start off and then I'll get.
Yeah, I think this would again be something where I think it's good to just be comfortable, transparent, honest with your patients. So Andrea's had a couple of cases where she hasn't been able to reach me because I'm on the phone with another patient, and for whatever reason, I know she's trying to get me, but it's not a good time for me to answer, so I don't. She knows that means I'm just busy. And so she says to the patient, you know what, I want to run this by Dr. Batla. We'll get back to you. And then after a few minutes later, we talk about it and come up with a plan, and we call back the patient together. So if I really think about it, that's not that different from what we do in the office. When the resident's not sure what to do, they'll say a similar kind of thing, and then they'll come out, they'll review with me, we'll go in together. So it's very, very similar. And in the same way, I can do field notes, and my resident can write up their own field notes. And so I find that the ability to give feedback is actually not a problem at all.
Ima, anything to add? Or Andrea? We'll go to Andrea first.
Sure, my video's going on and off there. Yeah, so I guess I'll just, Dr. Batla, describe what we're doing for a typical patient encounter, like when our schedules are running along together nicely, is typically towards the end of the encounter like we would in the office. And for the phone, I'll patch Dr. Batla into the call, and I'll let the patient know from the beginning that that's going to be an expectation if possible. And then together, really briefly, I'll summarize for Dr. Batla what the plan is, so he's up to date in terms of the history for the patient and what we've decided together as a management plan. And there on the spot, if he has anything to add at all, he'll have the opportunity to do that. So it's very educational for me as well as educational for the patient. And I know every preceptor does that differently, but that's typically what we would do in the office setting as well. So we're really able to, in most cases, when the schedule is running smoothly, operate that very similarly to the way we would in the office.
Okay, so I think we'll go to the question and answers here. I'm gonna take the first one, and I think it's already been partly addressed, but Sanjeev or Ima, could you talk specifically about giving feedback? Does that always happen in front of the patient, or you know, if there's something sensitive or corrective that has to happen, how do you handle that in this virtual environment?
I'll speak to it, but on the basis that I've not really had experience doing that. What I've often done with my residents with telephone consults is we discuss in advance. Typically, it's a follow-up or results discussion, typically, and we'll have discussed ahead of time. So that has been my experience. So I'll let Sanjeev and Andrea talk more. Perhaps you've had to, such a scenario that you've encountered.
I would say, and boy, I sure don't want to make it sound like I just have this as a pat answer. I have lots of examples that could demonstrate it, but I don't want to use up too much time. But again, it's really very similar to in the office. I always tell residents who work with me in the beginning, there may be some times where I actually do disagree with the plan. You know, I may think this patient needs a colonoscopy. I have to say so. And I need to change the plan. What the resident learns is, as long as it's done in a non-confrontative, supportive way, this is part of their learning, and it's very contextualized because it's with the patient. And for the patient, they're learning that, okay, well, they did say this is a learner, and they did say that he was supervising, which clearly he really is doing. So the patient becomes to believe in this whole process because they can see that I'm not just saying yes, yes, yes to everything. And then we do it the same again. So how that looks is it's on the phone instead of in person. And I think Andrea and I are probably going to move more towards using Zoom a lot more next week. And I just want to remind everybody that we've only been doing this for 1.5 weeks.
Right, and there's more of a comment than a question from Brian Sire that says that he's doing way more direct observation of my residents than I've ever done before. And now almost listening to every phone interaction. I think that's a really interesting comment, and he mentions how he can see the empathy and the history taking and observing those skills. I'm gonna skip down to another question here that's asking about clinic flow, and this is something that I've been interested in as well, because I've been starting to set up my virtual clinics for my return to work. How much time should I allow for a virtual visit compared to what I would normally do, where I would have a new consult scheduled for maybe 30 minutes and a follow-up 15? Do I need more time for a virtual visit?
Yeah, I'll jump to that, Kelly. I would honestly recommend you put in additional time. Typically for video, let me not say much for telephone. With telephone, it typically isn't that involved, but with a video consultation, I would suggest you allow additional time, because there might be technical glitches. Right now, everybody is making heavy demands of the internet, so we're getting this slowdown of the bandwidth. And also, you have people who aren't so tech savvy, so it takes them a while to get up to speed. So allowing for those sort of things will make sure your clinic doesn't run too far behind. Other than that, I think the rest of it it's pretty okay.
And another follow-up to that that's been asked here is about the scheduling and the idea of overlapping visits. Sanjeev, can you talk about that? You mentioned earlier that you might be on a phone with your own with a patient that you're seeing without a resident, and have a learner talking to another patient. So can you just give us a few tips on how that actually happens?
So I do this on a regular day when I'm in the office as well. As I'll look at the resident schedule, and I look at my schedule, and I'll make adjustments on the fly if I know that there's a patient that's going to take a lot longer or is going to need me more involved. So I kind of adapt as the day goes. It definitely is, from a timing point of view, a little bit more complicated trying to sort that out. And I'm actually surprised by how often it hasn't made us too far behind, but there have been times when we have been far behind and we've had to say, okay, what went wrong there? So I think it's really important to be comfortable with the idea that there are going to be glitches. Patients have been very understanding when we get back to them later than they expect. Especially nowadays, they're aware of the pandemic. So it's a nice opportunity to learn this kind of technology because our patients are very forgiving about it. But I think it also will vary very much based on a person's style of practice and their style of teaching. And so what scheduling might work for one person could look very different for somebody else.
Fair enough. A question that's come up here about accessibility and patients' comfort with video format. You mentioned that you use the phone a lot, but are there any tips or resources that perhaps we can share to get people quickly up to speed with what a video call would actually look like, and especially for some of our older patients who are probably less comfortable with technology?
Emmy, you might have more experience with this.
Surprisingly not. I had, when I started doing this, I had the same assumptions that the older patients might struggle. And yeah, as a group they did, but again, some of my top users were actually homebound seniors who got their grandkids to set them up on an iPad and they were good to go. And I'm talking about a background where they had to download an app, put a password in and use that going forward. I find with the Skype, being that it has the option of using a link, I typically will call someone ahead if I think they're likely going to have challenges and say, look, don't download the app, just click on the link and let it just open up. It will take you to the browser. It's a one-time use token, which is great. And I find that seems to work well. So I think making a quick phone call ahead or letting your staff just tell the patients, this is what to expect. And it will help smooth things during the video consult. And again, once patients have used it, I find majority of patients don't mind using that as subsequent means of communication.
Another very practical question here about scheduling. Do you give patients a certain time that, or a window of time when you're going to contact them?
Yes, absolutely. So they're told that this is when they're going to be called, and the staff are being told to tell patients that if you don't hear from them right at that moment, don't worry, that you're on their schedule and you'll hear from them, in the same way that sometimes we don't run on time in the office. So yes, we schedule somebody at specific times.
Perfect. Aaron, did you?
What I've done, a little tip. Sorry, Kelly.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just a quick tip. Yeah, what I've done in my practice again is I've color coded the appointments. So there's no specific time. We leave it flexible. So the patients basically choose when they want an appointment and we book them in, but it's color coded. So when I walk in the day, I could see quickly how many telephone consults I have, how many video consults I have. It gives me an idea. And so again, it could be a useful tip.
So a very practical question is floated up to the top here, and it's, again, when people are socially distanced and the learner and the preceptor are in their own home or offices and calling the patient, is this a teleconference? And any technical tricks to that? Andrea, did you want to maybe take that one? Is this just a three-way call, or how do you manage this?
Yeah, exactly. At this point in time, so Dr. Battle and I are both working from our respective homes, and we're using iPhones and just merging the calls. And yes, I think part of the question, the patient is always aware of who is on the line, because at some points in time in the visit, I have Dr. Battle involved, and at other times I don't. Typically, I initiate all of the calls just myself. I actually, at the beginning, when I kind of give the patient the spiel about the expectation for the visit, I let them know that right now it's just yourself and I on the line. Nobody else is listening in. But later on, we'll likely get Dr. Battle involved, and this is what that's going to look like. So it's very open communication there, and the patient knows exactly who's on the line. And we're just, using iPhones and doing a three-way call. And that, from a technology standpoint, has been basically seamless. We haven't had any issues there so far.
Anything to add to that, guys?
No, I don't think so. I can't remember exactly what the question was. Being honest, did we answer the question fully? I think so.
I think so. Yeah. Okay. So, question here about working from home. Andrea's already addressed that. I think that's happening more and more. So at the beginning of our call today, we did have some interruptions, and we are using a Zoom platform. Let's address that and address how do we protect the safety of our interactions with patients in this new environment.
You're talking a little bit in terms of hacking and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, there's been, we experienced a little bit of that at the beginning of the call tonight, and it's come up in the media recently. So how do we, is the telephone just a safer option then, or?
So I'd love to answer this, because not having much experience with this, I'm hoping that I can reach out to other doctors who don't have that much experience and say, start with where your comfort level is and take it one step at a time. So right now, my bigger comfort has been with the phone. I have been developing a good comfort with using Zoom with patients, and especially for counseling. But I am hearing about these hacks happening, and that might make me back off. So we need to adjust with time, and then we need to see how the developers and the IT people solve these issues. Obviously, if they're hacking into a service, I'm going to protect my patient by basically letting them know that this is a riskier way than talking and on the phone. And there are, of course, visits where I think we need to remember it's not the same as being in the room with our patient.
Ima, anything to add to that? Can I ask another practical question then about, if you're working remotely, both working from home, many of us have access to our EMRs remotely. How do you work that with your learner? Is that something that has to be set up ahead of time? And do the learners have access to the EMR?
Yes, and without that, they really can't do it, right? So if the learner is going to be working remotely, they need to go through the privacy forms. It really doesn't take long, and access remotely.
Aaron, you've been monitoring the chat box a little bit more than I have. Do you want to jump in and see if there's any other questions that you'd like to ask?
Sure. Jill asked a great question, Jill Conkin, about whether people have medical students involved that I'd like to answer. As most people on the call probably know, clerks across Canada have been removed from formal clerkship duties, likely until July or June 15th at a minimum. And so we are looking at ways, particularly with our students in the longitudinal integrated clerkship, to re-involve them in some form of patient care and keep them at the cutting edge, learning with their preceptors. So one of the tools we're developing right now is something called a virtual check-in. The virtual check-in is a little bit less open-ended than a typical medical visit, in the sense of the learner would check in with identified patients from their own preceptor's practice around a number of things, including general wellness. Are they able to meet their basic needs? And potentially do a little bit of counseling with them in a structured way around how to keep active in the confines of their own home, what they are and are not allowed to do in the sense of self-isolation. So we're developing that as a tool that we're hoping to roll out with our LIC students in the next couple of weeks, to allow them to get to know the patients who are in the communities that they're going to be. These are people who go to rural communities for most of their clerkship, and to allow them already to start interacting with those patients. If that's successful, there's no reason that couldn't be adopted on a more wide-scale basis. As Sanjeev and Ima have been saying, virtual care isn't a fast fix. It seems to take longer sometimes than the in-person visits. And so many practices will have people who require kind of a check-in and make sure that their patients are doing okay. And that could be of assistance to the preceptors as well.
Excellent.
May I just add, I think this is a great opportunity to teach our medical students. I'm chomping at the bit. I just want to make sure that I kind of have a permission to do it. But again, I want to make sure that we don't get in our own way. And there's absolutely no reason I think why we shouldn't. It just makes sense.
So there was a question here about the move to virtual patients because of the pandemic and concerns about increasing inequities in patients that already might be excluded. Does anyone want to address that and as an issue and that applies now or when the pandemic passes?
I would.
It is, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
I wouldn't mind speaking to that. Especially, I think, with our use of the phone in particular, not having to have someone set up on a virtual platform with Zoom, that's very accessible for most of our patients. Most of them are able to call in and at least make kind of a visit appointment. And I'm particularly interested for future practice in adolescent medicine and mental health. And I think this actually bridges a gap for some patients for whom there's a barrier in terms of getting into the office. So particularly in that patient population, there's a lot of ease and comfort with technology. And even if we're saying technology is just a phone visit, that removes the barrier of having to come into the office. That can also be the case for patients who have like severe anxiety disorders, new parents, etc. People who have transportation issues. We've already talked about elderly patients who are mostly confined to their homes. So setting up a virtual platform like Zoom and having the ability to do video conferencing might be one thing, but I think the telephone has a lot of potential in terms of actually removing barriers for folks, for the most part. That would be my guess.
Great answer.
Ima, did you want to add something there? You were wanting to say something?
Initially was, but Jill spoke to it. But I think Steve has something he makes reference to. I just saw in the chat here. So perhaps, Steve, if you would want to speak to it.
Yeah, sure. So hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Souls. I'm a recovering program director. And I also have a practice out in Siksika on the reserve. And I would say that my experience over the last couple of weeks, I've been having to do my clinics by telephone, and we're actually trying to redirect a lot of people away from the health center presently. One of the things I will say is that it's a bit of a two-edged sword. And the first part of that is that I have a number of patients who do not have their own transportation and rely upon transportation from others in order to arrive at the clinic, and have other obligations and family obligations that get in their way with respect to access. And there's many barriers that can be put up in their way. So for those people, making a telephone call can be a significant relief. But I, at the same time, have a great number of patients who don't have reliable access to a telephone. And they may have the ability to receive a call, depending on where their minutes are for that month. They may have the ability to go over to somebody's house to use the phone. But being available at a particular time in a particular location to use a telephone may not always be the easiest thing for them to do. And so working in some flexibility, as we do for our patients in physical visits around arrival times and availability, is something that we need to continue to do, and maybe even need to be more mindful when we're talking about virtual visits. It may not be the right time, it may not be the right physical space, and it may not be a safe space for them to have a conversation about some of the things they want to have a conversation about with you in their home environment as well. So just thinking about some of the contexts, double checking, hey, can you chat right now? Is right now an okay time? Are you in a place where you and I can have this conversation and you feel comfortable having that conversation? Having those things checked can be tremendously helpful. At the same time, I've got lots of patients for whom getting in to see me in person is a tremendous feat. And so offering those individuals a phone call is a big help as well. So just trying to think about the balance. I don't think there's one answer to that question when it comes to people who are disadvantaged in many different ways. Just being to contextualize it for that particular patient and think about what that issue might be for them.
Excellent. Aaron, we've got about 5 minutes left. You've been monitoring the chat box a little bit more. I'll throw it back to you maybe to ask the last couple of questions or final.
Yeah, there was a couple of questions in here. It would be interesting to get Andrea's perspective on, I think, about people thinking about usually what I do, and usually what I do when I'm teaching a medical student, if I have feedback, is I take them away somewhere a little more private and give them the feedback, or we talk about the case. And some of that is based on the assumption that doing that in front of the patient maybe causes the learner to lose face or become embarrassed. What I'm hearing from Sanjeev and Andrea in particular is that a lot of this is done in front of the patient, and that the patient is that the learning process is very open to the patient. The patient seems to be able to see that very clearly. So I'm wondering, from a learning perspective, I do think that's a bit of a shift for both preceptor and for learner. I'm wondering what that feels like. If that felt vulnerable in the first few times that it happened, and is it something that stays in terms of a vulnerable feeling or not, and what do the patients think about it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I've had experiences on both sides of the board. I have some preceptors who prefer to work in the fashion that I review the patient with them separately. We have the full conversation, and then we kind of come with a cohesive plan together after all the feedback's been given. And then the experience with Dr. Battler, where we typically review in front of the patient. Both of them have their pros and cons. I think the whole idea about saving face in front of the patient or in front of the preceptor and that vulnerability is something we should kind of work to get over. And I think the way we do that is just by mutual respect between the preceptor and the learner. And the reason I think that goes over so well in our relationship is the way that information is portrayed and delivered. It's not a matter of resident wrong, I'm correct, we're going to be changing the plan. It's presented to the patient in a way that's respectful of the work that I've already done, and educates the patient and myself. So for example, oftentimes Dr. Battler will validate the thinking that I've already done and bring the patient on page with that. I see we've talked about this and we thought about this. Here's where I think that your idea has some validity, and here's how I might do things differently, right? The patient is able to hear that. They hear the whole clinical reasoning, and I think they appreciate how much we are talking and thinking about their problem as opposed to just having a prescriptive response. Sometimes the patient's even involved in that conversation a little bit to be able to say, well, I like something better about the other plan, and then we can talk to them together. So it's like patient-centered, and it's not done in a way that makes me feel as though the work that I've done isn't valued. And I have had that experience with preceptors before, but I don't think the core of that is whether the review is done in front of the patient or whether it's done in a private space. I think it's totally about the delivery and the respect of between the two individuals and for the patient, right? So I think it can work very well in both ways if you communicate clearly. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just jump in for a sec there? I like to think of that as patient-centered resident teaching. The other thing, though, is if a resident or medical student is not clearly ready to do that, they absolutely need to be given the opportunity to receive feedback privately, and there's no reason why you can't do that. And so you certainly can still do that too.
Perfect. Aaron, any last questions? We're approaching 8 o'clock.
Yeah,
maybe go ahead, Aaron.
No, you go ahead, Kelly.
I was just going to throw this out to the panelists and maybe even Lindsay, who's on the line as well. The pandemic shall pass, and it may be several months, but this too will pass. Do you think that this is going to change the way we deliver care in the future? Is virtual care and virtual teaching here to stay in some part? Maybe I'll throw that to Ema first, and then get the other panelists just their thoughts on that.
My opinion is a bit biased because I've been using virtual care for a long time, and I think what the pandemic has done is simply accelerated what has been coming on for years. most jurisdictions in the US, most of Europe has embraced this form of care. We've been embracing it, but at a slower pace. And again, there's been a lot of regulations and challenges. As I speak to you, I know that TELUS is deploying a video feed into its app. So it's going to come in the next 2-3 weeks. And so many other providers are coming on stream. So yes, I think it's going to become more widespread, and patients haven't experienced it will likely have a bigger appetite for it. It works in a lot of instances for everyone. Patients don't have to leave work and come in. We don't have to worry so much about the physical space, in fact, of seeing patients. And you could see patients at different venues. For instance, you could schedule an afternoon and simply do follow-ups and virtual visits without having to go into work and so on. So I foresee this becoming part of our repertoire. How much it remains afterwards is just the question. Thank you.
Sanjeev, what about you? You're new to this. Are you converted?
I have no doubt that I'm surprised that we haven't gotten there yet. It actually has always made sense to me. And I think it's time that our society moved along a little bit in terms of you know, I, like many of the physicians who are probably listening today, they are fee for service, and those codes for virtual visits could disappear. I think we need to show that this is a valuable part of care and make sure that we make it workable from the IT point of view and from the remuneration point of view. But I think it's the way to go. Yes, I'm sold, Kelly.
Okay. And Andrea, what do you think? You know, you've got a few months left in residency. When you're out there setting up practice, has this experience changed your thoughts on this?
Absolutely. I didn't really reflect on this much before COVID happened, and I just got thrust into it, got voluntold into the experience. But now I've been reflecting a lot more on mostly what we talked about earlier and what Dr. Mansoulis had brought up, that I think it's our responsibility to be adaptable, creative, and flexible to meet our patients' needs. And I think this has a potential to be a great tool for that. So if it's something that we can use and gain some expertise in, which I think you can do pretty quickly and pretty easily as a physician, then I think that's absolutely something we should work towards and hang on to in the future if it can help us with delivering patient care. And as a learner, I think the experience has been pretty seamless as well. I don't have too many negative things to say in terms of involving this in residency, kind of going forward in the future. I think it would be really valuable.
Okay, Lindsay, as a current program director, maybe get your thoughts on that, and then I'll throw it back to Aaron to wrap. So,
sure. In general, I think, you know, everyone has been thrust into this, to speak to Andrea's point. And the first 2 weeks here plus have just been really seeing people's overall comfort level. And it's been really interesting to have many conversations about vulnerability and the fact that we're all trying this on, and that patients are very willing to share some of that vulnerability with us. And that's been one of the best parts about being family doctors when we're making this big thrust forward. And I think it's really exciting to actually see how we're going to be able to integrate a lot of different types of learners. And it's been really good on the chat to see the conversation around medical students, the ability to reach out to patient populations that we're maybe not thinking about as much. And in addition, a lot of the ways that we can assess and keep building into a resident skill set. I think we're going to learn so much in a really short period of time. It's just going to take patience and willingness to make mistakes as we go. And I would say from all the conversations with preceptors, that's what we're all willing and accepting at this point.
Excellent. Aaron, over to you.
Well, thanks everybody. We survived a little bit of Zoom bombing at the beginning there. I want to thank all of our panelists today. It's been a really interesting conversation. And I really want to thank all of the people who've tuned into the webinar. I know people are overwhelmed with trying to learn about COVID, and it's very heartening for me as an educator to see up to 100 people at one point in the conference tuning in to think about how we educate and take care of our learners as we go forward in uncharted territory. I think I want everybody to remember that for our learners, this will be the defining moment of their training, and that as preceptors, we have a big ability right now to make a big impact on our learners, to help them to see what's most important about patient care and how we go on with patient care even in the face of adversity. So thank you to the panel. Thank you to the attendees. We will edit this and hopefully get it out as a video on our DLRI YouTube channel. And I will take all of the questions that have, some of which have not been answered today, and put those together in a question and answer document that hopefully we'll be able to link to that. Any final thoughts from the panel before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say that if anybody did want to reach out and ask a little bit about how, now that I'm an expert, to feel free to email me at sbatla@ucalgary.ca if they want to hear a little bit more on ask personal questions about how it may work for them. I'm happy to be there for my colleagues.
Great. In the chat, I've linked some resources that people can click onto. The AMA webinar, which talks a lot about the nuts and bolts and billings of virtual care, as well as the College of Family Physicians of Canada tip sheet for virtual care. And Lindsay added a tip sheet that was produced by McGill University as well. So we'll keep all those links and we'll add them to the show notes on the YouTube video as well. Thank you everyone for your time tonight. It's been a great webinar and I appreciate you all taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Aaron, for the opportunity. And special thanks to the Alberta PLP team that helped on the back end to put on the webinar tonight. So thank you, team.
Yes, thank you. Big thank you to the PLP team who did a lot of behind the scenes work to put this together very quickly.
Yeah. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.